everyone, and welcome to episode 105 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So, for many of you, hopefully you've listened to the last podcast on the Spring Property Report, and there was certainly some very revealing statistics that we put forward in that investing from outside of capital cities, particularly into Melbourne at the moment, is becoming more and more common. Now, it was quite common during the pandemic, in that it was probably more focused though then on home buyers and people looking for a lifestyle change, looking to get out of certain locations to get into others where perhaps there was a little bit more flexibility, a bit more warmth, a bit more ease of movement. So it has been happening, but it's probably more now to take advantage of underperforming markets, and it's more from an investment strategy perspective, and that's what we've noticed within our own business over the last 3 to 4 months, people looking to take advantage of markets that perhaps are a little bit flatter, and that's Exhibit A is being Melbourne at the moment. So is it as simple as applying logic in that, well, this is what's worked in my current city, I'll just take that and apply it to the new city, and I'll have the same success? Unfortunately, it isn't that simple, and there are a lot of things that need to be considered and taken into account before you do start just going forth and investing in another location. So I thought today we could have a look at a few of the what, where, why, and hows of buying remotely or buying in another capital city or another location, and things that you should keep in mind, and reasons that you should do it. Okay, so let's have a look at the why. And first and foremost, it's typically from a diversification perspective is why people would look to invest in another city. Usually they've got existing holdings in a current location, so you might just own your own home, or you may have invested to have investment properties in those locations as well. But typically people will, most commonly, particularly if they're doing it themselves, they'll look to invest in a market that they already know. But it is a good thing, and the reason that they look for the diversifications is to have exposure to different markets. It gives you a bit more variety, reduces your risk, but also perhaps markets are moving at different rates. And obviously then there's other benefits too, things like, say, land tax, which is a state-based tax, and so therefore looking at a different city means that you could perhaps reduce your land tax exposure and expenses payable. There might be better opportunities in an alternate location. Markets, obviously, as I said before, move at different rates and at different paces and are at different stages across the board. So depending upon what stage of a cycle a certain market is at, it might be a good opportunity to get into that and then have it work in your favour, particularly as what we've seen in the past sort of 3 to 4 years, where there's been some really strong growth and equity built up in other capital cities, and Melbourne at the moment is the one that's probably lagging behind a little bit, and therefore there can be opportunities to be had, and that's what we're certainly seeing at the moment. And then another element is the incentives and reasons to invest in others. I mentioned land tax. There can be different depreciation benefits and requirements there as well. And then different expectations on investors. So we've seen a lot of increasing of minimum standards from a rental perspective in Victoria in recent times, which I think generally is a good thing, but it can also mean that there's extra expenses for existing holdings. So perhaps if you're looking to get into a different market, there might be lesser requirements in those areas, and that might be an added advantage that people will look to take on. The next one is where to look. And generally, I would still suggest that you focus more on the capital city side of things. There's just a greater level of economic diversity in that type of investment location, which is really important because of those market. They're quite often the key market drivers to get the performance that we're looking for. So things like having better employment opportunities, great education facilities as well. You tend to find that population growth is greater in capital cities, and the infrastructure is usually better as well. So roads, public transport, health, as I said before, education. So those sorts of things are key drivers to keep pushing capital growth forward. Having all of those attributes mean that you do get a greater pressure on demand and prices going up as well. So they're probably the main key aspects there. When to do it? Well, this is very much a personal preference, as we always say with purchasing property. It should be very much around what you need and what you want. So if you're in the right financial position to be able to buy a property, perhaps if your expenses have been minimised, or there's been a pay increase, or there's been equity built up, when is the right time for yourself is the most important thing. But if you're looking at it from then, okay, well, I'm ready, but I would like to get into the right market cycle, then we can look at market conditions. And in terms of timing the market, there's the most common attributes that people are looking for is actually similar to what we're experiencing in Melbourne at the moment. In that there's been, if you're looking at it from an external perspective, so from an interstate point of view, if you've built up equity because you've had strong growth in a Brisbane or a Perth or an Adelaide over the last 3 to 4 years, you've built up strong levels of equity, you're looking at what's an affordable alternative and where is their scope. So if you go and look at, well, where else could I invest? What you're typically looking for is where's a location that's had a proven track record over an extended period of time where there has been really good levels of growth, and something that perhaps has been held back for a period of time now. And that's typically what we're seeing in Melbourne, is that it has had a really good track record in historical sense. And it has been held back compared to a lot of other cities around the country in recent times. So people are looking at it and viewing it as an opportunity, as an affordable alternative, given they've possibly done quite well in their own city in recent times. And then it's a case of what should you be looking at? And this is a really interesting one. And it's obviously a key component to any investment property purchase. And there's key attributes to buying a really good investment property. And you always need to remember, as we always speak about on the podcast, that capital growth needs to be the main focus. Yield is obviously important, but there's ways that you can improve the yield going forward. But the key fundamentals for investing and for growth are usually the fundamentals that the property already has, and are usually difficult things to change. So if you've listened to the podcast regularly, you'll know that I've spoken about this ad nauseum, but the things are strong underlying land value. So we want something that's got a really good land component to it in an area where land is at a premium, not readily available, and there's a strong demand to have land in that location. The second attribute is scarcity value of the property. So not something that's being replicated and having more and more of the same thing being built. And then the third element is getting a property that's got multifaceted demand. So we're not reliant just on one buyer profile. We might have first home buyers, we might have upsizers, downsizers, and investors. If you can get a property that ticks all of those boxes or as close to those as possible, then having that multifaceted demand means that you'll get far more consistent growth over a period of time. So the fundamentals are there. That's the sort of thing that you need to apply. The trick, though, is that what meets those requirements in one city may not be the same thing that drives it in another. And so it's vital to understand what the key factors, not only in the city that you've been, but what are the key attributes, not just the city, but in the suburb, and then what's important about that suburb that will drive growth. So we look at that intimately in Melbourne and understand what are the key attributes in certain suburbs in terms of location they may not be in other. And I use regularly as an example, say, being close to a pub in a suburb like Fitzroy is a popular and sought after thing, but in another suburb like, say, Hawthorn, more of a barrier and a distance is probably more appropriate. So understanding what's acceptable and what's not is really important, and be able to take that to other cities is something that I think people need to be able to get. And one of my, I guess, key advice points to clients who are looking to buy interstate is having someone who has got a feet on the ground understanding, and having professional advice of someone that lives and breathes property in that location, I think is really, really important. Not just someone perhaps who might come in and come out and might know the market generally, but not know it intimately. And I think an intimate knowledge of a market is really, really important. So if you are going to seek advice from someone, make sure it's someone that does have that intimate knowledge in those areas. And now the final one that I wanted to go through is how. And how is really important. It's probably the biggest thing when you're going about buying a property remotely or interstate when it's not an area that you're familiar with. You would think that in a country the size or population of Australia, that things would be fairly similar and that you'd be able to take your knowledge from one city to another and it would be pretty well appropriate. However, it's really not the case. There are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences, and some of those, they might only seem like minor differences, but that can have a major impact on your decision making and your actual acquisition in the end. So I'm going to go through a few of the differences, but there are a lot more, and I don't profess to know them all. I know the Melbourne and Victoria market well, but I don't necessarily know what happens in Queensland and New South Wales and Western Australia and South Australia. So it's important to get local knowledge if you're looking in those sorts of locations. But some of the examples are, for instance, auction registration. Now, for many of you, if you are in Victoria, you'll know that we don't need to register to participate in an auction on a Saturday afternoon here. However, if you go to New South Wales or to Queensland, you do have to register. You have to provide photographic ID to show that you are who you say you are. Whether you're having someone else bid on your behalf, they need to provide ID as well. So understanding that you can't just turn up on the day to an auction in Sydney and start bidding. That's not how it's going to work there. Again, on an auction process side of things, vendor bids. In New South Wales, the auctioneer only can do one vendor bid. In Victoria, it's unlimited. So I've been to auctions here where there's been 2 or 3. I've seen some where there's been 6 and 7. In New South Wales, you'll only ever see one. And so they'll set the barrier, and you'll know if you bid beyond that you're not going to have another one put in over the top of you. Whereas in Victoria, that's still potentially a possibility. Quoting is a really interesting one, and that's that differs greatly. Obviously, in Victoria, we have our statement of information. It's mandatory for residential property that has to be provided, and there'll be a quote price on there, either a fixed amount or it will be a range with no greater than 10%. And where possible, there'll be comparable sales that have got strict requirements that they need to be provided as well. Whereas you go to other states and it's very, very different. So, for instance, in Queensland, speaking with Megan Wells, it's unlawful to give any indication about price for a property that is being marketed without a price. So if you look at something on, say, realestate.com and there's no price advertised, it's going to auction this weekend, then the agent's not allowed to talk price with you. They can provide comparable sales that have been ticked off by the vendor and approved, but they can't talk price. You've got to do your own homework and get your own understanding of where things are going to be. Very different to here. New South Wales, they can provide, and most of the time they do provide sales price and quoted guides, but there's no mandatory requirement to, so they don't necessarily have to talk price with you. So there's these understandings, and what you might expect if you're a Victorian going up there, you're not necessarily going to get. Cooling off period, in Victoria it's 3 business days. In Queensland, New South Wales, it's 5 business days. So again, knowing if you're going down the private sale path, what's provided and what's not. And then finally, again, in Victoria, where in the section 32, so in terms of information that is disclosed by the vendor prior to purchase, there is a lot of information in a vendor statement or a section 32 in Victoria. So you are provided by the vendor, and the vendor is required to provide you with a lot of information up front. And again, in other cities and other states, that's not necessarily required. So you might go to buy a property in Queensland and expect that everything in that document is what you would expect to get in Victoria, but there's a lot more onus on the buyer to do your own homework, do your own due diligence, make sure you understand about what's provided and what's not. So really get a clear understanding of that. And I think it really goes to show why having a professional advice when you are looking outside your comfort zone or you're outside your own area is so important. I don't want this to be a sales pitch, but I would suggest that anyone who is looking to buy property outside of their state really should have professional advice, whether that's a buyer's advocate, whether that's seeking legal advice, whether it's building inspectors. You need to have local knowledge to really provide you. And I do think it should be someone who is based in that state, who knows that state and knows that market intimately, so that you know you're getting the right advice and you know you're getting the right support from the very start, so that you'll make the right decisions and limit the risk of making the wrong decision and buying the wrong type of property. So that's about it for episode 105 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. As I mentioned previously, we are now recording the podcast and producing it on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to watch it there and also to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, please share the podcast with friends, family, and colleagues, anyone who may have an interest in residential property in Melbourne. Otherwise, if you'd like further information, visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.